In 1892, Dadabhai Naoroji was elected MP for Central Finsbury. He was the first Indian to enter the House of Commons. Naoroji was a Zoroastrian who in 1855 moved to England as a cotton trader and professor of Gujarati at University College London. In 1866, with funding from Indian princes, he established the East Indian Association to press for the Indian civil service to be open to Indians, and also to publicise the drain theory. After a period back in India, where he was the founder of the Indian National Congress, he returned to London and stood in 1886 as Liberal candidate for the solidly Conservative seat of Holborn, where we now are. Lord Salisbury, the Conservative Prime Minister, thought that no constituency, and I quote, was ready to elect a black man. And there is Lord Salisbury, a Doge of Venice, spurning Naoroji, a reference to Othello. Naoroji, beg your pardon, won the neighbouring seat of Finsbury in 1892, where he supported Irish Home Rule, votes for women, the abolition of the House of Lords, and the rights of India. In 1901, he pulled together his writings in a famous book, Poverty and Un-British Rule. In this book, Naoroji attacked the hypocrisy of the British, proclaiming that they would rule India in the interests of Indians. He quoted Queen Victoria in 1858 in her proclamation on assuming crown responsibility from the East India Company. The proclamation stated that our subjects of whatever race or creed be freely and impartially admitted to offices in our service. Went on to say that it is our earnest desire to administer India's government for the benefits of all our subjects. In their prosperity will be our strength, in their contentment our security, and in their gratitude our best reward. Well, Naoroji complained that these promises were broken, with the result, and I quote, that the present system of government is destructive and despotic to the Indians and un-British and suicidal to Britain. At this stage, Naoroji was not calling for independence, and he accepted, I quote, the very bright side of British rule and the many blessings of law and order which it has conferred on India. Indeed, he could even be read in these remarks as being a modern apologist for empire. He referred to Britain's humane influence in banning sati. He referred to the introduction of English education, which, he said, taught the highest political ideal of British citizenship. And he referred to the freedom of press and speech. But this is, in a way, getting at the hypocrisy of the British. He said the current rule of India was un-British. In what ways was it un-British? Well, first of all, because Britain was impoverishing India by draining out of India £30 million a year. Taxes were raised in India and spent in the United Kingdom, so that, he said, the masses of India do not get enough to provide the bare necessaries of life. This drain was continued by a large deficit on trade between India and Britain. And the deficit on trade, Britain selling more to India than India sold to Britain, that drain was increased by the cost of servicing loans from Britain to India, by officials remitting their savings to England and then drawing their pensions in England when they retired. The cost of governing India was borne partly within Westminster. The drain, he said, removed capital from India to Britain which then gave Britain a monopoly of trade and industry, which further exploited and drained India. How, he asked, was the trade deficit between Britain and India covered? Well, it was by India selling opium to China. This, he said, was a sin on England's head and a curse on India. The opium trade fills up England's drain. India derives not a particle of benefit. On top of that, he said, India clearly needed railways, as in the United States of America. But there was a difference about the way in which railways were provided, he said, in India as against the United States. In the United States, the workers were American, and expenditure from loans coming from outside America to build the railways remained in the country. It bought American iron, American railway locomotives. This was not true in India, he said. The loans paid salaries to directors in London. It paid for European staff who held the senior positions, who returned some of their salaries to England and then drew their pensions back in England. The costs of working the railways were partly paid to England. The interest on the loans were paid back to England, and the government of India guaranteed an extraordinarily high rate of interest on those loans, more than could be received in other countries. The result then, he said, of building the railways, which are undoubtedly a benefit, was to increase the drain. He said that as India is treated at present, all the new departments opened in the name of civilization, advancement, progress, simply resolve themselves into so much new provision for so many more Europeans and so much new burden on exhausting India. So railways, irrigation works, and so on were merely adding to the drain. Even more than that, he said, there was a drain of expertise and knowledge which left India when the Europeans retired home. The British might be educating the Indians. He himself went to a very good college, Elphinstone College in Mumbai. But he said, those Indians who had that education, I quote, find themselves simply so many dummies, ornamented with the tinsel of education. And then, once they have that tinsel, their whole end and aim of life is ended because they couldn't be employed in meaningful jobs. So he said, the English boasted of introducing education and then act as if all this boast was pure moonshine. Well, even further, he said, the pressure of taxation levied by the English on a country with a low per capita income meant that there was double the level of English taxation in India. He said, the only reason why the Indian government does not go into bankruptcy is that it can, by its despotism, squeeze out more and more from the helpless taxpayer without mercy or without let or hindrance. He went even further. He said that the English claimed to be free traders, free markets, free trade. But he said this is not really true. I quote, free trade between England and India is something like a race between a starving, exhausting invalid and a strong man with a horse to ride on. Free trade between countries which have equal command over their own resources is one thing. But what can India do? Before powerful English interests, India must and does go to the wall. He said that it was not a fair balance then, a fair power balance. Indian industry needs protection from British exports. It gets worse. India was paying for English-British imperialism elsewhere in the world. You see on this slide Indian soldiers in the First World War. Naoroji said that all the wars by which the British Indian Empire is built up have not only been fought mainly with Indian blood, but every farthing of expenditure incurred in all wars and proceedings within and beyond the frontier of India by which the empire has been built up and maintained has been exacted from the Indian people. Britain has spent nothing. There is the great injustice that every expenditure occurred, even for British interest, is charged to India. So not only within India, but Indian troops being sent overseas. The overall result of this catalogue of drains is that there were two Indias. One India was rich and prosperous, the India of British officials and capitalists who carry away enormous wealth. They could not understand the second India, the poverty-stricken India. I quote, "This India, bled and exploited in every way of their wealth, of their services, of their land, labour, and all resources by the foreigners, helpless and voiceless, governed by the arbitrary law and argument of force, and with injustice and unrighteousness, this India of the Indians became the poorest country in the world after 150 years of British rule, to the disgrace of the British name." Well, he was saying things like this in the House of Commons. You can imagine it caused some consternation. The overall result, he said, was that the British Empire is built up entirely with the money of India and in great measure by the blood of India. Besides this, hundreds of millions, or more probably several thousands of millions of money, which Britain has unceasingly and ever increasingly drawn from British Indians and is still drawing, has materially helped to make Britain the greatest, the richest, the most glorious nation in the world. But Indians had no say in the expenditure of revenues or in the good government of India. The British, he said, again, were hypocrites. They had a glorious struggle for constitutional representative government, the Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, the Great Reform Act of 1832. They urged this everywhere on other nations. But on the other hand, they maintained what he called a desponding despotism themselves in India. And this was disastrous for England itself. It meant it was undermining English values and character. It was leading to a body of Englishmen trained up and accustomed to despotism, with all the feelings of impatience, pride, and high-handedness of the despot becoming gradually ingrained in them, and with the additional training of the dissimulation of constitutionalism. The English in India are descending and degenerating to the lower level of Asiatic despotism. So, the overall result, he said, is that British rule was bad for Britain. It was also bad for India because it deprived the people of wealth, work, and wisdom. Now, this argument of Naoroji continues to shape current-day discourse. A recent book by a current Congress MP, Shashi Thakur, Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India, is very close to Naoroji, although he goes even further in arguing that there was a deliberate policy of de-industrialization by the British, and going as far as to call for reparations from Britain to India. In other words, what I've just been talking about is current politics and not just history. So there is one book published in 1901, part of this debate around the nature of the British Empire. And I want to turn to a second book which came out a year later. That is the book by another liberal politician, John Hobson, who in 1902, during the Boer War, published Imperialism, a Study. So it was provoked by the Boer War, which he thought was a terrible mistake, and also by the social problems of poverty and unemployment within Britain. Naoroji argued that British rule was impoverishing India. Hobson argued that imperialism was caused by an entrenched poverty within Britain. In his view, imperialism benefited only a particular small group within Britain. The main concern of Hobson in 1902 was the scramble for Africa. And he said that recent annexations of tropical countries, procured at great expense, have furnished poor and precarious markets. Imperialism, he said, was a distraction from what would make Britain economically efficient and powerful. He said, our most profitable and progressive trade is with rival industrial nations, whose territories we have no desire to annex, whose markets we cannot force, and whose active antagonism we are provoking, in other words, the United States and Germany. The benefits of imperial expenditure, he said, went mainly to suppliers of armaments and public loans, to planters in the empire, and to officials. Above all, he said, the empire reflected a struggle for outlets for investment, for surplus capital within Britain. So, I quote, he said, Great Britain has been becoming a nation living upon tribute from abroad, including from India. And the classes who enjoy this tribute have had an ever-increasing incentive to employ the public policy, the public purse, the public force to extend the field of their private investments. So receiving tribute from abroad, then spend it to increase imperialism. This aggressive imperialism, which costs the taxpayer so dear, he said, which is of so little value to the manufacturer and the trader, is a source of great gain to the investor who cannot find at home the profitable use he seeks for his capital, and insists that his government should help him to profitable and secure investments abroad. So why could the investors not find profitable outlets at home? He said because there's a lack of domestic markets to absorb production and capital. Why was that? Because there was a maldistribution of consuming power which prevents the absorption of commodities and capital within the country. The rich were oversaving. They had so much money, they couldn't spend it all. They oversaved. But because the poor people were so poor, they couldn't buy commodities, buy goods. Therefore, the oversaving of the rich, the underconsumption of the poor, led to imperialism. The economic root of imperialism was monopoly profits, unearned excessive income of this small class, and it led then to a false economy of distribution. The solution, he said, was social reform, was to redistribute money from the rich, oversaving, to the poor, under-consuming. Imperialism was a parasitical distortion of the economy. So he said, it is idle to attack imperialism as political expedients or policies unless the axe is laid at the economic root of the tree, and the classes for whose interests imperialism works are shorn of the surplus revenues which seek this outlet. So Naoroji saw two Indias. Hobson saw two Englands. In the south, the consumer's England, living off investments with conspicuous waste and ostentatious leisure, which called into being trades based upon their patronage, trades which were antagonistic to useful industry, a playground, he said, for socially reputable sports and entertainment. And these people, here enjoying Ascot in 1910, were the supporters of imperialism and militarism. Meanwhile, in the north, a producer's England was based on industry in which well-to-do workers were engaged, with skills, with an active associational life, supporting economic and social reform. Now, again, this argument of Hobson has been very well supported by many modern historians. Two influential historians, Peter Kane and Tony Hopkins, use the phrase gentlemanly capitalism. The empire was supported by the gentlemanly capitalists, a fusion of the landed aristocracy and the City of London. As the rents of landowners dropped in the late 19th century from competition from American, Canadian wheat, those landowners intermarried with the families of financiers looking for status. They went to the same public schools, they went to Oxford and Cambridge universities, they dominated the government in a nexus of the Treasury and the City of London, which, according to this view, ignored northern industry. It led, according to recent work of the historian Youssef Cassis, it led to a renewed elite, which added the financial power of the city to the prestige of the old aristocracy. An outstanding example of this, the Baring family, the merchant bank here in the City of London. The Barings married into the family of Earl Grey, of the Reform Act and the tea fame, intermarried into the Harwoods and the Grenville families, aristocrats. The Barings Bank funded the Louisiana Purchase of the Midwest of the United States. They funded the United States cotton trade. They were involved in loans to Argentina. But Thomas Baring, the first Earl Northbrook, was Viceroy of India. His relative, Evelyn, first Earl Cromer, worked as his private secretary and went on basically to rule Egypt after the loans that the British had made to Egypt were defaulted. So it's these sort of people who are the so-called gentlemanly capitalists. And it's a recent book by two American historians, Davis and Huttenbach, Man in the Pursuit of Empire, say that the owners of the overseas investment were predominantly from the south of England. So you see that London, shareholders in a sample of companies, London was a major investor in Imperial, but not in domestic industry, whereas non-metropolitan domestic industry, not in the empire. So they say there are these two groups of capitalists here. And they go on to argue that the costs of the empire fell upon taxpayers in general, who paid for excessive defence costs, whereas the benefits went to the social group that Hobson was talking about, the consumers' England of the South. Now, if we were to put together Naoroji and Hobson, we immediately have an answer to the question that my lecture posed: who benefited from the British Empire? If they're right, then the clear answer is India suffered a drain of wealth that went to Britain, where it benefited southern English bankers, landowners, and officials. It did not benefit, within England, northern industry and workers. But is this right? I would suggest that there's an element of truth in all of this, but it's also too simple. That matters within Britain and within India are actually rather more complicated. We need to look much more closely by drilling down into the politics of imperial relations between metropole, the home country, and the colonies, and we need to look at the internal dynamics within both to complicate this picture, which shifts over time and was much more complicated than our two late Victorian and Edwardian liberals assumed. Let me turn, first of all, to the politics of the Raj, the politics of India. In my first lecture in the series, I argued that Britain in the 18th century had a trade deficit with India. India was selling fine quality muslins to Britain. Britain was actually draining wealth to India. It was sending out bullion to India. That changes in the second quarter of the 19th century, when India became the only major area of the world with which Britain had a trade surplus. So you see here, India has a, looking at it from India's point of view, has a trade deficit of £60 million with the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has a deficit with continental Europe of £45 million and with the United States of £50 million. The only major area with which Britain has a trade surplus is India. So that was absolutely critical to Britain's ability to run a global economy in the late 19th century. Now, why did that come about? The book Inglorious Empire by Thoreau, which I mentioned, makes some astonishing and incorrect claims that there was a drain in the 18th century from India to Britain. No, that's not true. The drain in the 18th century was the other way. It turns around. He also argues that the British, the East India Company, was systematically destroying looms and cutting off the thumbs of weavers to stop them weaving. Well, actually, no, the East India Company made its money by selling muslins to England. The people who wanted to stop industrialization in India, of course, were the Lancashire cotton textile industry. And what that suggests immediately is to complicate the picture I've been telling you, which is that the East India Company, in fact, gentlemanly capitalists, were losing out to the Lancashire cotton trade. So it's a bit more complicated than that. The main reason why India deindustrialized was technical advance in British industry, allowing competition with Indian textiles, initially in third markets, and then finally, in the second quarter of the 19th century, Lancashire could compete within India. And that deindustrialization of India was common to the periphery of the world economy in the 19th century. The share of the Indian workforce in industry fell from about 15 to 18% in 1800 to 10% in 1900. But the Indian textile industry did not entirely collapse. It survived by cutting prices, using machine-spun yarn, although that, of course, affected the independent status of weavers. And also within towns, weavers were producing the most valuable artistic cloth, used, for example, saris for women, mixing together gold wire with silk and cotton, which the English producers couldn't do. So there's some deindustrialization, not entirely. The labour from the industries moved into agriculture, where wages fell. Farms were unable to sustain so many workers, and there was a loss of supplementary income from weaving to compensate farmers in times of hardship or famine. So we need to look at that in the general terms of what was happening at the periphery of the world economy. But there were also signs of a reversal of cotton production in India. So you see the percentage of imports of total consumption in India dropped. That's what's coming from, particularly from Lancashire. Indian mill production starts to rise. And you see the handloom production does continue to be quite a substantial part of it. So we need to be a little bit more cautious than Thoreau is about what is happening. By the late 19th century, cotton mills were developing in Bombay using cheap labour, but also machinery, which is actually more modern than what was being used in Lancashire. The key person here is another Parsi Zoroastrian, Tata, who built the cotton mills in Nagpur, and then his son went on to build the massive Tata steelworks, which you see there, and also hydroelectric power and the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. There's also, and I'll go on to talk about this again in a moment, a rise of jute spinning and weaving in Calcutta, in part financed and operated by British firms. This development of these industries, jute and cotton, is going to have a major impact on politics within Britain itself. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, how was the drain, the trade deficit that I've been talking about, the cost of supporting all the troops in Britain and overseas, how was that going to be paid for? Well, Naoroji was right. Indian troops were being sent overseas. 11,000 Indian troops were sent to China in 1860, for example, and a massive number of 1.2 million to fight in the First World War. And the cost of this of the home charges, the drain, was getting higher because India was on a silver standard. The rupee was silver-based, which is depreciating against the gold-based pound. You may remember the importance of being earnest when Miss Prism tells her charge, "You will read your political economy in my absence. The chapter on the fall of the rupee you may admit. It is somewhat too sensational. Even these metallic problems have their melodramatic side." Well, people at the time realised, actually, that's not just a joke, that is true. It did have a melodramatic side. As the value of the rupee was dropping, you need to have more taxes to pay the home charges, which are denominated in gold-based sterling. That causes political problems in England. But also, the fall in the value of the rupee means that Indians trying to buy Lancashire goods, valued in gold, are having to pay more. So it's hitting the Lancashire cotton textile industry. Now, who is going to win out in these debates? This is difficult political decisions, both in India and in Britain. If you were the Viceroy of India, you don't want to stir up problem within India. You're concerned that increasing taxes to pay the drain, which is getting higher because of the rupee question, will lead to problems of resistance if you increase the land tax or the salt tax. The land tax was a major source of revenue. And the way in which the land tax was levied reflected different ideological views within Britain, which created different groups within India with different views on taxation. Let me just explain that very quickly. So one way in which you could raise land tax in England was through what was called the permanent settlement of Bengal in 1793. You gave a permanent right to hold the land to a zamindar, like this elegant man here, for paying a fixed amount to the British government, or to the British government in India. The peasant cultivators on this huge estate would lose their rights. The idea of the British government was, if you gave a person like this absolute right to land for fixed charge, they had an incentive to improve the land because they would increase their profit. They would be like an English improving aristocratic landowner. Unfortunately, it didn't necessarily work out like that. There was a disadvantage that they spent their money on building palaces, upon ostentatious display, so it was argued by the English, and therefore, because the tax was fixed, you had to try and raise taxes by other means. The alternative view, adopted by radicals in Britain, like John Mill and John Stuart Mill, both of whom worked for the East India Company, Don't have people like that. Work with small peasants. If you can give small peasants secure ownership of their land, they will have an incentive to invest. So you have different views within Britain, creating different sorts of societies within India. So the zamindar against the riot, the peasant. And that actually did lead, the riot system, to greater prosperity in the Punjab than in the zamindari system of Bengal. So there's local variability, which reflects both the local structure of society and Britain's engagement with that to enforce different ways or not. Now, the land tax declines. The other major source of revenue are the monopolies on opium and salt. That declines. What goes up? Tariffs. On whom do the tariffs fall? England, upon the English cotton producers. So that is going to create a problem within within England. If you are a Lancashire cotton textile producer, and it's also already becoming more difficult to sell your goods in India because of the change in exchange rates, you don't want to have a tariff as well, do you? So in the late 19th century, there's a battle going on. If you're a gentlemanly capitalist, like the Viceroy, the easiest thing you can do is to impose tariffs. On the other hand, if you're the Secretary of State for India, a British politician sitting in the cabinet, your concern is winning the general election. And which was the area of the country which was a swing area, which would go from Conservative to Liberals? Lancashire. So the gentlemanly capitalists might have the money, they didn't have the votes. So we need to look very carefully here at how these debates go on. So my argument would be, in the late 19th century, there was great difficulty increasing the tariffs because of the backlash coming from Lancashire. So tariffs were introduced at one point in the 1890s, 1894, in 1896, abolished. But let's run ahead. What happens with the First World War? It changes. India had supplied 1.2 million troops in the First World War at their expense, and also donated £100 million to support the war effort. At the end of the war, India has a massive debt, also rising nationalism. What the British government decided to do in 1919 is to grant fiscal autonomy to India, the right to charge its own taxes. And what would you do if you had fiscal autonomy in India and you don't want to stir up more nationalism? You increase tariffs. So at that point, Lancashire is going to lose out. And of course, Lancashire, in any case, was now not the swing area that was going to make or break governments. So you can see how this is creating difficult problems. And it affected nobody more than Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill had been MP for Oldham in a cotton textile area. At the end of the First World War, he was MP for Dundee. Dundee was based upon jute spinning. This is the great jute spinning works of Cox Brothers in Dundee. But is facing increased competition from Calcutta. What is he going to do? Well, he was caught in a terrible dilemma. He didn't want to give fiscal autonomy to India because they're going to put tariffs on the goods coming from here. But he's a free trader. In the Liberal government before the war, he had introduced Trade Board Acts and minimum wage legislation, which applied to jute industry. So the industrialists are saying, what we want is protection against cheap Indian goods, and we want to take away the minimum wage legislation. The workers say, no, we don't want to take away the minimum wage legislation. They go off and vote Labour. And the manufacturers are not satisfied by the fact he's a free trader and doesn't want tariffs. He loses the election in 1922. He goes to the south where these issues are not going to be so important. This issue comes back, again, to affect Winston Churchill in the Second World War. Just before the Second World War broke out, it was agreed that if any Indian troops are used overseas in a forthcoming war, Britain would pay. Burma had been separated from India in 1937. Japan invades Burma. Who is going to pay for the troops in Burma? Britain. So at the end of the war, there's a massive problem about Britain having to pay for that. The sterling balances, blocked sterling balances. Winston Churchill said, well, we shouldn't pay. John Maynard Keynes at Bretton Woods conference also said, well, we can't afford it. But it was realised by the British government that they could not break that obligation. Leo Amery, the Secretary of State for India, a leading conservative and supporter of imperialism, criticised Winston Churchill. He said, when driving to the station to catch a life or death train, I should hardly think that you would tell the cabbyman you have no intention of paying when you get there. So again, there's this big issue that is going on here about who is going to pay for this contribution. Indian independence was a foregone conclusion at the end of the war. It was simply too costly to maintain, but Britain did try to keep up the payments on the sterling balances. So what I'm arguing here is that the allocation of costs and benefits within and between India and Britain reflected more than a dominance of southern gentlemanly capitalists. We need to analyse shifting political calculations that changed over time. Now, for the final minutes of the lecture, I want to raise another area for which I could give another lecture of the same length, but I'll just mention this very, very quickly. The question here is, what is going on? Is it globalization or is it imperialism? And there are different views on this. How important is imperialism to the development of the British economy of the later 19th and 20th century? One view is that globalization would have happened anyway, that the costs of the empire were unnecessary. Formal control was unnecessary. And that view was put forward by Adam Smith in 1776, same year as the American Declaration of Independence. He said, why pay for fighting to keep the American colonies? It's much better we voluntarily give up and just have a trade treaty with them. That would be more advantageous to everybody. Richard Cobden, the great Lancashire free trader, leader of the Anti-Corn Law League, said the same. Free trade, he said, brings nations together in peaceful exchange. We don't need to have imperialism to get our foreign customers visiting our markets. They're not brought hither, he said, through fear of the power of British diplomats. And that's the same argument made by modern historians, Davis and Huttenbach, to whom I referred. They said the basic problem here is that who is benefiting from the empire, the cost of defence? The white dominions. He said the Australians were free riders. They didn't need to have a navy or an army because they had us to look after them. And that the costs then meant a high level of taxation within Britain, which fell upon the workers. And if only we had given up the empire, British taxes, they said, could have been cut by 12%. And we all know, if we believe Dr. Kwarteng, that if you cut taxes, you have faster economic growth. And this is absolutely right, that in fact most overseas capital did not go to the empire. It went to the United States, it went to Argentina and other countries. So they said, you don't need the empire. The money that is going overseas doesn't necessarily go to the empire, it goes to recent areas of settlement in temperate countries, not into the empire. So on this view then, you don't need the empire, that the benefits come from, for example, the Vesti family investing in meat in Argentina, which benefits workers. Again, it's not necessarily the gentlemanly capitalists. It's investment in grain production and transport. And who loses from that? Landowners, whose incomes dropped by 40%. Rents dropped by 40% in the late 19th century. So the argument here is that you don't need to have investment overseas. Of course, the alternative view of Joseph Chamberlain in the 1902, remember that date of Hobson, is that you do need it because Germany and the United States had massive internal markets, much bigger than Britain itself. So that in order to develop, you need to have a modern system of protection. You need tariff reform, preference for the empire, and that would be the big market that Britain needed. Now, the Liberals remained committed to free trade. They said that imperial preference would lead to waste, it would lead to higher rents for the landowners, and according to Chamberlain, they were going to solve social problems of unemployment by arguing that you would have a protected home market, that would lead to full employment. And they said, no, that's not true, it would lead to high food prices. The Liberals said, remember, you need to have social reform by redistribution. Well, in the 1906 and 1910 elections, it was the free traders who won. Free trade leads to prosperity, and protectionism with Joe Chamberlain leading to poverty and immiseration. But of course, this changes in the interwar period. Joe Chamberlain's son Neville introduces imperial preference in 1932. So again, attitudes change, things change over this, and at the end of the Second World War, during the Second World War and after the war, it is argued by the Labour government that you need to have imperial preference because that's the only way in which we could get markets for our goods at the end of the war. So those arguments continue to be fought over. So that takes me to a third possible argument here, which is to say, well, okay, perhaps you don't need the empire, but even if you didn't have the empire, and you only had globalization, you would still need to have the navy. Because the whole issue about the free trade system of Cobden is we were dependent upon food imports. So there's great concern about food security. Therefore, you would need to have the expensive British Navy anyway, even without the empire. So the cost of defence wouldn't have been reduced. There wouldn't have been a premium of cutting taxes if you got rid of the empire. And in any case, are we sure that Britain was more taxed than France and Germany? Because France and Germany had conscripts. If you add in the cost of taking away 2 years of people's lives, perhaps the cost of taxation was actually higher than in Britain, which didn't have conscription until the wartime period. And you should also, of course, take into account the view of the supply of the troops coming from India during the First World War, which was a massive return. So, okay, the argument there is, without empire, but with globalization, did you need to have the cost of military defense? Well, that takes me to a final view on this, which is the view of the modern historian Niall Ferguson. He said empire was a jolly good thing because it spread modern values, and it spread I quote, the spontaneous action of markets. Britain was spreading economic liberalism. I quote, the British Empire acted as an agency for imposing free markets, the rule of law, investor protection, and incorrupt government on a quarter of the world. So, he says, globalization went with imperialism in the ugly word he has coined, Anglo-globalization. Now, these arguments continue to be fought and argued. The World Bank, for example, has picked up on some of these arguments of Ferguson, and they see that as a way of spreading development. It's a sort of, if you like, new form of Western cultural imperialism. My view is that both Cobden and Ferguson are misleading. Globalization was about power. We shouldn't just be thinking about it as being imperial direct rule power, because if we were thinking about Argentina, it's about the power of capital ownership, what we call informal imperialism. So you could have formal rule and also informal rule. If Britain owned the railways, the banks, in the land in Argentina, did it really matter whether or not it was part of the direct rule from Britain? So what I'm arguing in this lecture is that the costs and benefits of the British Empire have always been disputed. They were part of that debate in 1902 between Hobson and Chamberlain, between Naoroji and others who supported Indian rule. It was disputed within Britain as well as within the colonised areas. So current debates do not reflect some sort of woke war on our heritage. These issues are actually our heritage. We need to understand the issues, which are complex. Politics shift over time. We need to analyse the interplay of different interest groups, both within and between Britain and the Empire. We need to see how were choices actually made. We need to consider what was the result of formal imperialism, what was the outcome of globalization and industrialization. In either case, the result was a great divergence in the 19th century between core and periphery of the world economy, a point I made in my first lecture. This discrepancy, or divergence between core and periphery of the world economy continued even after decolonisation. It is only now, within the last 25 years or so, 30 years, that it's being reversed, that there is now a little convergence after the great divergence. Could Naoroji have ever imagined that Tata now owns Jaguar Land Rover? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's a wonderful lecture as usual. Just before I open questions to the floor, one of the recurring themes of your talk is a sort of a small group of individuals gathering wealth at the expense of a large population.
Yeah.
So the word you never used throughout all this was greed. And yet I just wondered how much that overlaps with many of the policies and sort of financial consequences of the decisions of individuals rather than of states.
Well, I think that's right. If we go back to our people like this, you got inequality within India. So there was complaint within India that people like this are being supported by as agents of British imperialism, really. That they are allies, so that leads into inequality. But you also got the issues within Britain of these people. there is the massive debate within Britain at the time of Hobson, who is supporting the introduction of progressive tax. So 1909, 1910 budgets of Lloyd George. So there are debates going on here about how these people have inordinate power. But it's also, I can pick up your point, that these people actually then become the state. What is the role of these people within the government, the city treasury nexus? And I think the point there is that, yes, these people are very, very rich. But there are also, of course, the realization that Lancashire has the votes. So Bill Rubinstein, who's done this great study of who owns wealth, keeps saying that it was always the case in Britain that industrialists were not the richest people in the society. It was the Rothschilds, the Barings, the landowners. And this is picked up by Keith Joseph, who says, look, it's these people dominated. We've got to get rid of these. We've got to have the industrialists. But in fact, if you add together all the total wealth of the industrialists and their votes, they have the power. So they can push back. So you do, in fact, have the 1909, 1910 budgets, which leads to greater equality. And by 1945, really is there has been a switch in distribution of wealth. So I'm not sure.
It's getting there. Yeah.
I think you said at the beginning, that for Naoroji, despite him compiling this catalogue of drain and arguing vociferously against it, I think you said that he wasn't out and out for independence. He was just for a kind of British influence. So why wasn't he out and out for independence?
Well, you have to think about what is practical politics. So when he started out, he was basically trying to shame the British into giving Indians a role within the government of India. It wasn't at that point practical politics to demand independence. I think if you go into the 1930s, of course, the attitudes are going to be changing then. He was dead, of course. But even then, you have a debate going on over how to modernize and develop the Indian economy. So you have the Congress setting up a sort of planning commission, which then fails when the Congress leaders were put in prison. And the British rulers in India come forward with their own planning system, and some of the industrialists who were part of the Tatar Empire come forward with what they call the Bombay Plan. So there's this debate going on there of, can the British actually take over some of the views that the Congress have been developing to plan and develop the economy, and that then to stop independence. So and I think the interesting point there is all those three plans, if you like, are drawing on the same ideology of Fabian planning, like the post-war Labour government, post-Second World War Labour government. So I think there's a dance going on here about at what point can you actually start to actually demand complete independence. Naoroji at the late 19th century, very beginning of the 20th century, is not practical. By the 1930s, it might be. By the Second World War, I think, from what I was saying, those costs of paying off the debt that Britain owns to India means basically that most British politicians say that the game's not worth a candle. And what they want to do then, I didn't say this in the lecture for lack of time, they say, we're going to invest in Africa instead. That if we invest in Africa, give up India, invest in Africa, that will then give us the earnings we need to balance the trade with the United States of America. But what they want to do still is to keep India within the Commonwealth. So I think it's a gradual process over time. Naoroji was simply wanting to have Indians part of the British rule.
Thank you very much, Martin. Just to say that Martin's coming back in the autumn to talk about paths to modernity, Cold War, decolonization, and economic transitions in a series of 3 rather exciting lectures. So I hope you'll join me in thanking Professor Martin Daunton for this evening's lecture.